There's currently a debate going on about whether there's really persecution of Christians in northern Nigeria. So let me be explicit up front. Yes, there is persecution of Christians in northern Nigeria. But before I proceed, let me explain I'm not saying this from a political perspective. I'm not a MAGA person. I've complained about US government restriction of refugees, about deportation of Haitians, and the like. My wife is a former refugee. My concern is about justice, whether it's from the perspective of the right or the left. I really don't care whether it's from the right or the left who are highlighting something. We just need to stand for truth and justice. And I lament that whenever one side speaks for the truth on something, the other political side tends to discount it because it's coming from the wrong side. In the late 1990s, before Boko Haram, before the kidnapping of the Chibok girls, I was in northern Nigeria. I taught there for 3 summers, and pastor friends there told me about friends of theirs who had been killed. They talked about attacks by jihadists. Some of them who were captured apparently were foreign jihadists. So I want to tell some of those stories just to say this has been going on for a long time. This isn't something that just sprang into the news just now. Well, yeah, it may have sprung into the news in certain circles just now, but it's not news in northern Nigeria. It may be news in some other parts of Africa, even. I mean, the news doesn't always get out everywhere, including in some other parts of Nigeria. But I talked with a friend there who is an Anglican pastor and a professor with a PhD. And he was talking about something that had happened before, I think in the 1980s, when he was doing campus ministry. And he just had one child at that point, and he and his wife and his baby were in an upstairs apartment when supposedly spontaneous riots broke out in the predominantly Muslim city. The university where he was doing ministry was more integrated, it had students from around Nigeria, but it was a predominantly Muslim city. But though the riots were supposedly spontaneous, people knew where all the pastors were living. They must have mapped it out in advance because they went from street to street killing the pastors. And the reason he lived to tell the story is because of his Muslim neighbor downstairs, who went out as people were throwing rocks and so on through his window. And he and his wife and baby were huddling under a table. The neighbor downstairs went out and said, "This is a house of peace." And so the attackers left and went on to the next pastor's house and killed a pastor there. I had friends who were under siege for 3 days in a church with a corpse and no water. There was a bomber who attacked a major church, a headquarters church of a denomination where I preached. When I preached there already in the 90s, people were anxious. They recognized that these things could come there. I was asked to speak from the book of Revelation. I talked about persecution as well as other things. And a couple of years after that, that church actually was attacked by a bomber who would have killed a whole lot of people had he not, as he was driving into the church to blow it up, ran into a motorcycle. And unfortunately, some people were killed, but it saved most of the people in this very large church. Now, the next thing I'm going to say, there are a lot of people who will like to contradict it. And I'm not saying everything that they're saying is wrong, but I am saying that what I'm saying, I was there. I witnessed this. Late 1990s, Yelwashandam, I saw churches all over the place. I was teaching a large gathering of local pastors there. I don't know the exact number, somewhere between 40 and 100. I think maybe 50 is a good estimate, but whatever it was. I was teaching a large gathering of local pastors there. And when I was having dinner with some of them, there was uh, there were also a group of Muslims sitting off to the side and a foreigner there, I think the only other foreigner in town, as far as I knew. But he was in Islamic apparel also. He was with them. I don't know if he was from the Middle East, but he definitely was. He looked like he could be from somewhere like that, wherever he was from. He definitely wasn't from Nigeria any more than I was, gesturing toward me. But less than a year after I was there, Yelwish and the Christians were attacked, and the churches were turned into latrines. Lots of people were killed, other people fled. Some of the pastors I taught were, I was told some of them were killed, others of them fled. In any case, there was barely any media coverage of this. But suddenly, when local Turok uh, people from the neighboring areas converged in the town and attacked it, suddenly it made international news that there was an attack on this Muslim town. Well, that's true. It was a Muslim town because there were no Christians left there, because the Christians had been killed or driven out. The BBC is usually one of the best in terms of international media. I appreciate what they do, but there was one early report where they flew a reporter in to make comments about what had just happened, who took what certain Muslim local journalist sources said, completely ignoring the Christian voices. I was there. I taught pastors there like a year before this. I know it had a Christian population before this. Another friend of mine from Kaduna, from southern Kaduna, which southern Kaduna State is predominantly Christian, northern Kaduna State, including the capital in Kaduna, predominantly Muslim. Uh, all this we knew back in the late 1990s. But I had a student named Sunday Agang. What I was trying to think was the date. I have it written down, but that's not relevant at this point. So Sunday just got news that, okay, Muslims had marched for Sharia to be imposed on the state. And so some Christians did a countermarch. The report was mostly women and children doing this peaceful march in Kaduna saying, no, we don't want Sharia in the state. Most of them had come in from the south, from Kafanchan or wherever else. They were harassed and then attacked with gunfire. And from the report that Sunday first heard, he thought his cousins may have been there, uh, his brother may have been there, his wife may have been there, and some of them had been killed. Uh, it turned out that I think one of his brothers, no, one of his cousins had been killed, not his brother, not his wife. But at the moment, we were praying together. And of course, he was distressed out of his mind, concerned about the safety of his wife and his family. And I was praying, God, arise, defend your people. And Sunday prayed for forgiveness for the attackers. And I was humbled to be in the presence of such a man of God. He's worked for peace between Muslims and Christians in the area. And there was a time when there was a lot more peace between Muslims and Christians in the area. But the more radical jihadist agenda has provoked a lot of other things. So um, one Nigerian colleague whose name I won't give, but again, this was back in the late 1990s already. He was risking his life traveling around areas of conflict and collecting hundreds of names of those who had been butchered, and collecting their names, their ages. So he's getting all this information. I asked him. He sent me a copy, which was really kind of expensive because it was like a whole dossier of information. September 2001, thousands were killed in the Jos area. I mourned when September 11th happened in the US, but I thought, okay, September 7th, just a few days before this, jihadists had attacked Jos, slaughtering so many people in coordinated attacks. I was thinking, okay, now somehow the world is going to pay attention. Unfortunately, some of the younger Christians who didn't agree with their elders' idea of turning the other cheek, they said it's not working, and they retaliated. And so you had a lot of Christians killed and a lot of Muslims killed. Now, it's politically prudent for governments to play down casualty numbers and politically prudent for them to tone down internal strife, not least in Nigeria, where sometimes, at least in the past, when you'd have reports of Christians killed in the north, Northerners would get killed in the south. Sometimes the Northerners were, well, often they were Muslims. Sometimes they were Christians. Southerners assuming that all Northerners were Christians and that the Christians killed in the north were only immigrants from the south. Many of them were, but many of them weren't. Places like Jos was predominantly Christian when I was there. Plateau State, where Jos is, was predominantly Christian when I was there. So you have reasons for certain sources to play certain things down. You also have reasons for people to pretend neutrality because it puts them above the fray, makes them sound like, hey, we don't have any bias here. No matter what the truth is on the ground, like in some places, really, you do have one side killing a lot more people than the other side and a lot more innocent victims on the other side. Or at least, anyway, moving beyond that, just to say, and this will get me in trouble, but it is also certain circles considered acceptable to lie in the service of religion. Those are not helpful sources. And pretending neutrality also helps ensure continued access. And during apartheid, I know that there were some who were, I was among those who were sponsoring an ad in a certain Christian journal, an anti-apartheid ad. And the Christian journal refused to even run the ad because they said it might jeopardize their coverage of events in South Africa. So anyway, I expect some people will call me a liar. I've already been called that for saying things like this back in the early 2000s. And I consider those who are calling me a liar to be those who are believing liars. But in any case, that was a long time ago. That was a quarter of a century ago. But it's been so much worse since Boko Haram and ISIS. Back in the late 90s, that was before Boko Haram. So it was also before the kidnapping of the Chibok girls, which thankfully this one was exposed by the political left in the West. Feminists rightly protested what was going on there. So that one made the news. But in Nigeria, the government was initially like, why is everybody complaining about this? This is happening all the time. By the time the Chibok girls had been kidnapped, there had been hundreds of other girls kidnapped, and boys as well. Boys recruited to fight alongside the jihadists. I'm using the local, what I was told they were locally being called by the Christians there. But there were hundreds of girls being kidnapped. They could be used as wives for the fighters. And this has happened in other countries too. I mean, you've got like 2 million people displaced by jihadist attacks in Burkina Faso. You've got about 1 million people displaced, mostly Muslims, but many Christians in northern Mozambique. And, when the Muslims don't cooperate, they're not considered radical enough. And Christians there have been beheaded and crucified and other things. Anyway, I shouldn't digress. But um, we have so many eyewitness accounts where the girls have been uh, married to fighters or gang raped or whatever else. But sticking more with the point I'm trying to make here, and besides the explicit jihadists, you had the conflicts between the herders and the farmers in predominantly Christian regions, herders from the north as the Sahara is spreading southward, herders, most of the Fulani have been Muslim, and so you had conflicts before. Although Archbishop Benjamin Kwashi, former Archbishop, retired Archbishop of Jos in Plateau State, shared with me recently, Anglican Archbishop, shared with me recently how when he was growing up, most of the time, most of the farmers and herders got along. The herders would come at times of the year when, you know, there wasn't a harvest or things like that. So there were a lot of them getting along. But suddenly, now in the last decade or so, Fulani herders have automatic weapons. So the conflicts that were occurring and have been occurring now for a few decades, but exploded into them attacking farmers now with automatic weapons. And what happens when if you're driving, if you find a body alongside the road, and then some miles down the road you find somebody driving the car that once belonged to that body, you might think that those two events have something to do with each other. At least probably, at least you might look into it. But we now have a lot of farmers displaced and killed, and people living on their property. And some people aren't asking why. Again, you've got about 2 million, 3 million people displaced in Nigeria, many of them Muslims, many of them Christians. But a lot of the people who are doing the killing and the displacing are, anyway, let me stay on the subject. So, one of my PhD students, Yakubu Philibus, talks about how uh, in his community they had boys from the age of 10 up and to men. The men and the boys above the age of 10 had to spend the nights in the bush to watch out for attackers. In Borno State, the Boko Haram had taken over most of the areas in Borno State. So they hadn't taken over that area because people were standing watch. It was by far the majority Christian. So what happened was, although they had sticks, they didn't have automatic weapons, but they were called by the military to a meeting. All the men were supposed to show up at a meeting to discuss defense procedures and protection. So the men went. But what they didn't know was this wasn't really the Nigerian military. And this stuff is well documented that many military installations had been overrun. So Boko Haram had captured a lot of military uniforms, weapons, vehicles, and so forth. And also, this will be more disputed, but in response to bribery, people also were able to get a lot of things. There's a lot of corruption. But again, trying to stay on point. So on June 3rd, 2014, men showed up to this meeting, although certain groups of men had been warned not to come, and I won't go into that. But vast majority of Christian men showed up. They were gunned down, and some of them burned alive. Yakubu's mother went back a few days later, and she, with some others, there were too many bodies. The report was there were thousands of bodies. All they could do was throw dirt over some of them. They couldn't bury them all. Now, Yakubu lives to tell the story because about a week before this, his parents had decided, this is going somewhere bad. and sent him and the other youth in his family away. So now they're scattered all over the place. They're dispersed, some in Cameroon, some in different parts of Nigeria. No two of them together, but they're still alive. Well, some say, okay, there's no genocide against Christians there. There are other people being killed there too. That is true enough. Uncooperative Muslims are also killed. But what we're talking about is whether the report that there's a genocide against Christians going on. Yes, there are other people being killed, but don't change the present subject. Hitler was killing Roma people, he was killing gay people, he ended up killing Poles and a lot of other groups of people. But if you say that to deflect attention from his deliberate genocide against Jewish people, you are reasoning immorally. One recent report, this is the kind of stuff that gets me really upset. One recent report said, hey, in recent years, there have been just 300 Christians killed for being Christians. Look, far more than that number have been killed inside churches by attackers in recent years. Even if you want to narrow it down to just those killed specifically on Christmas and Easter and so on in recent years, there's more than 300 Christians being killed. So, in any case, estimates based on photos, interviews, and so on, thousands of Christians were killed in 2024 alone. And I don't care whether the reports are coming from the right or from the left. I've been trying to call attention to this for a couple decades. One time, I was pretty young back then. It was around 1978. I was present when a Christian that I knew was talking to a journalist who was making a presentation. I think the journalist was also a Christian. But when the Christian mentioned that a genocide was taking place in Cambodia, the journalist responded, no, if that were going on, we'd know about it. Well, some people did know about it. He didn't know about it. The Christian's source were some missionary friends. And the journalist didn't believe it. The Christian said, we have photos. Many Western experts considered it just propaganda. You know, similar belief has met most genocides when they were first happening, including from the US government during the Nazi Holocaust, including from the US government initially during the Rwandan genocide. As thousands of people were being massacred, the US government was initially denying that a genocide was occurring. Obviously, they eventually recognized that it was occurring. After tens of thousands of people had already died, in my book, Suffering, Its Meaning for the Spirit-Filled Life, I talk about various genocides as well as a lot of other kinds of suffering. I give a lot of detail on Nigeria because I spent time there. The book was published in November of 2025, but when I wrote it, it takes a lot of books, it takes like a year for the book to come out. When I wrote it, barely any US media were talking about this. At least one US media outlet has been talking about it more, but now it's a big thing because the president talked about it. And so now but when I wrote the book, initially nobody in mainstream media was talking about this. So, again, I'm not trying to take partisan sides in this. Unless it's part of a sustained strategy, US intervention might just provoke more attacks against the very victims it claims to protect. I don't know. I'm no expert on this. But please, whether you're on the right or the left, don't dismiss the reality of systematic attacks on Christians in northern Nigeria. Yes, other people get killed too, But Christians are also being targeted, and they're being targeted in churches. They're being targeted for their faith. Some of the survivors say they told us to deny our faith or die. And they didn't deny their faith. And they were left for dead. They were slashed, left for dead. And they managed to tell about it. Others were told, their husbands killed in front of them. You go back, you tell others, don't come back here or we'll kill you. There are Boko Haram videos that they have put online to publicize. They want Christians to know, don't come back to this area. I was shown one of those videos. I couldn't finish watching it, but I saw enough of it, more than enough. Please recognize there really is genocide against Christians going on. This isn't just a political issue, a partisan political issue of right or left. This is an issue of life and death for those of us who are Christians, for many of our brothers and sisters there, as well as for other people who are suffering.